A few loose reflections around the questions of what is Strauss pointing to with the concept of the second cave, um, which I've given the rubric the cave of history. I think Strauss himself says it in similar words, if not exactly the same um, phrase. And the question of Epicureanism. So, first of all, on reflection, I would say it wouldn't really make sense to say that Strauss rejects or denies the possibility of Epicureanism, because what he would say, it seems to me, is that we have been effectively refused the means to a proper analysis by which we can ask if Epicureanism is good or not. Um, one thing I would say in general is I wouldn't want to give the impression that my interpretation of Strauss is actual Strauss on one gross point, which would be by tendency, I myself probably am more in the direction of the desire for reason and to be able to think over things um, properly in contradistinction or antithesis, or said in some antipathy to um, political action or change in daily life. Because I think Strauss himself, um, everyone who came into his classroom immediately, well, if not everyone, but quite a few people immediately had the sense that Strauss is talking about the solid, everyday considerations and real life, and not the uh, 10,000 uh, feet in the air abstractions. Um, so the second cave, the issue, I guess we should have a preparatory word, which would be that Strauss said that up until the age of 30, he was basically a Nietzschean. He believed everything that he could understand out of Nietzsche, um, and also that he was a Zionist. So after that point, he became more critical. Um, so the point here would be in order to understand Strauss's position, we have to understand something of Nietzsche's arguments and the way Nietzsche's arguments broke down some resistances in the prevalent adhesion to tradition, where tradition uh, means um, the liberal tradition, Enlightenment tradition, or whatever traditions existed in scholarship. For instance, issues Nietzsche is concerned with classical philology. So the idea being that the classical philologist, an idea which, by the way, has no support in our own time, or very little, which would be the classical philologists have this purpose of keeping the possibility of liberating the teachings of the ancients in such a way that they have become available to the youth, or at least that part of the youth which was fit for the higher training. Because I suppose there's a transition where after you had large urban populations from the fact of the breakdown of large agriculture, and you had started to get in the 19th century these large factory worker populations, um, the tensions in Nietzsche's time between the break of what was going to have to happen were unique and not exactly comparable to our own day. And then the question of education, what the education is going to be, became tumultuous in those years, especially right after the culture conf and so on. Um, so the crux of it would be that Nietzsche has this notion of the historical consciousness, and he distinguishes himself from all the earlier philosophers by the notion of the historical consciousness. And this, uh, we have many avenues to state what this means, but it means something along the lines of that whatever our views are, whatever we think makes sense is actually a prejudice, and it's a prejudice due to our position in history. Um, it's a prejudice due to the moment we came into existence. And so there's a fundamental aleatoriness or desolatory sense to this, which is to say, our views are in some way totally haphazard by this view. So what Nietzsche says is basically, if you have this notion that there's a some kind of lust for truth or something that's driving us to want to know, not, let's not say truth, let's just say knowledge or science. So there's something in the human being that drives us towards knowledge or science, but is it really uh, knowledge or science? Nietzsche says what you're really doing is you're trying to prove something you already believed in, and then every time you talk about knowledge, is you're talking about trying to produce some kind of proof in something. So Socrates wants to prove that justice is really about making the citizens better, rather than what was actually the empirical truth in Athens in his time and before his time. Why not just say justice is identical to the law and identical to um, the customs, habits, etiquette, and daily ethics of Athens of that time? Why insert something new? And then Nietzsche says it's somehow that there's always a prejudice, and Socrates has a prejudice like everyone else, and the prejudices always take the form of a kind of jackass which says continually "iya, iya, iya." So "ya" meaning yes. So there's constantly a yes saying to life. The yes saying to life means an obdurate insistence on some point, even though it cannot be demonstrated. So we can't demonstrate to ourselves that knowledge properly exists. We only know in some empirical way. There's arts, there's shoemakers, there's people who make computers. We have empirical knowledge, but this notion of the truth or science um, relies on a yes saying to this notion. Once you have the notion of that jackass that says yes to life, then you have, this is basically the same as the will to power. So there's always some jackasses operating in us, clusters of them, and they're arbitrary, and they yield what they yield. And then you can see how that, where all the different arbitrary pushes were in the interpretations of Plato during, say, the Victorian era, when certain sexual issues were scandalized, or um, I'm not even sure if that was true. Maybe the scholars were better in that time than they are today, I would almost suspect. But what whatever the custom of the country was, that will come into the thinking, because the individuals that live in that country have had a certain breeding. They have certain uh, what Spengler basically analogizes to the movement of herds of wildebeest. There's something below the starting threshold, which we grow into, and then when we begin to spin out arguments and ask whether they make sense, this all bleeds in. The probingness, the the depth of Nietzsche's attack on the tradition adhered to, um, Strauss finds liberating in a way. So this is part of the point. So again, so we wouldn't even, properly speaking, we're not even able to analyze whether one position is good or not, because we can't quite free ourselves enough to be in the position of a Socrates who is the first time raising these positions properly. Okay, so that's a very uh, kind of a little sporadic piece of a, larger statements that need to be made concerning all these issues. And I think we're raising some issues that need to be raised with regard to Strauss's general um, position. All the forms in the historical cave have this form of the remark that the best men of our age do not know how chance the forms that we live by are, whether that's government, whether it's style of architecture, whether it's a style of the mores of daily life, whether it's fast times at Ridgemont High, or whether it's someplace in the South where one would think of abortion, or what, all these things have a fundamental questionability, such that we become aware that the different historical moments um, forbid uh, um, a single timeless playing field. So this concept of the accident as being set off against eternity and constituting time in the Christian world, which was developed in the Christian world, becomes questionable. We see how even the concept of time is questionable, and so on. Um, so it could as well be that I haven't understood Strauss perfectly yet, which is undoubtedly true, but it also could be that there's some of this is still open within Strauss himself. And also in the future, I'm kind of pushing towards this position that Strauss and Heidegger aren't that far apart in quite a few respects. But okay, we'll try to answer what was written in the comments better in the upcoming recordings.